went to Iraq the first time, I had this idea in my head that I could be a moral actor, even though the war might be wrong, even though I knew what war was like from reading and being a professional military officer. The idea that I was going to maintain my own moral agency within something that itself was so powerful, I was never going to have that agency. And I think that's what we're seeing over and over again is people losing their agency, losing their control, trying to regain it. And oftentimes under the thumb of really tragic and brutal trauma, right? Again, whether it's like we've been talking about the wars, the incarceration, the economics, et cetera. What the juxtaposition for me then though is the fact that we are up against, and you brought up Nader and independent politics and the Green Party and everything, what we're up against as our adversaries here. Those who are in control of such things, those who run the war state, who run the incarceration state, who put the policies in place that allow for us to be the most economically unequal nation in the history of the world. I read a thing that you got to go back to the pharaohs to find a time that was more economically unequal than it is now. They are in control, and they are able to put forward things that maintain that control, that power. And I just want to, touch on your other essay, the Stop Pretending America is a Functioning Democracy. And I just want to read a couple of paragraphs from there because I think you really get it. I think you really what you're communicating is so important about our current structures and about why it seems so impossible for us to take control. And so you're right. Anti-politics masquerades as politics. No sooner does one money-drenched election cycle end, the next one begins, perpetuating what Sheldon Wolin calls politics without politics. These elections do not permit citizens to participate in power. The public is allowed to voice opinions to scripted questions, which are repackaged by publicists, pollsters, political consultants, and advertisers, and fed back to them. Few races, including only 14% of congressional districts, are considered competitive. Politicians do not campaign on substantial issues, but on skillfully manufactured political personalities and emotionally charged culture wars. You speak a bit about the militarists, which I think we're going to get more into in a bit, but then you finish with, you end it with by saying, our corporate overlords and militarists prefer the decorum of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. But they work closely with Donald Trump and are willing to do so again. What they will not allow are reformers such as Bernie Sanders who might challenge, however tepidly, their obscene accumulation of wealth and power. This inability to reform, to restore democratic participation, and address social inequality means the inevitable death of the republic. Biden and Democrats rail against the cultish Republican Party and their threat to democracy, but they too are the problem. And so, when we're up against these forces, when we're up against, as again, the type of things that the Greeks and Romans would name as gods and sacrifice doves and bulls to and have myths about, to try and understand these things that are uncontrollable. I think I was thinking today as I was thinking about this talk with you, I remember when I was in college back in 1993, 1994, I heard Ted Koppel give a commencement address. And Ted Koppel talked about pessimism. And he said how those who were among Jews in Europe in the 1930s, those who were the most pessimistic are the ones that lived. And he was kind of giving an ode to pessimism, right? And which is very not like what you usually have at a college commencement address. So I'm not sure how well received it was. But I take from your writing these kinds of things. And so I think what a lot of people want to ask is, what do we do? What do we do about this? When we're up against these forces, these things that seem uncontrollable, that are driving people to participate within their own destruction, basically, or driving people to join things that are avenues for them to try and regain their own power. What do we do on the left to counter that?
Well, I wouldn't call it pessimism. I think the problem with a lot of very well-meaning people, 350.org would be an example, is that they've misread power. They believe that the Democratic Party would respond in a real way to climate change. They surrounded the White House when Obama was president, although he wasn't physically in the White House at the time on that weekend, and chanted, we are your supporters. And that was just a misunderstanding of power. So you can't fight power unless you understand how power works. And power spends a lot of time blowing a lot of smoke in your face. For instance, I'll be on October 8th surrounding the Department of Justice to call for the Department of Justice to relinquish its demand that Julian Assange be extradited. But the Department of Justice is not the agency that is orchestrating the attempt to extradite Julian Assange. It's the CIA. The Department of Justice is just a puppet. So, and I think that they're quite happy to have us surround the Department of Justice, especially on a weekend, whether they care. But I think that's often a problem, that the left doesn't, and that's partly because the left doesn't really come out as centers of power, very rarely. But having worked for the New York Times, I was the Middle East bureau chief for the Times, a Balkan bureau chief, I was very close to the centers of power. I had to report on the centers of power. So I understand the inner workings of power as a reporter. I mean, I had a kind of window into it that I think many people are denied. I know how cynical, brutal, and murderous power is. And I think you saw it in the Marine Corps. I had to laugh when you were talking about joining the Marine Corps or the military to change anything. My mother lost her job when I was in college, and my father had gotten me I would have had to drop out, and he got me a job working in a men's clothing store, which I had no intention of doing. So I signed up for officer training in the Marine Corps. I remember when the recruiters came, because you could go to Quantico for 6 weeks and they'd give you enough money, I could have stayed in college. Turns out I became an RA and I got free room and board, so I didn't have to do it. But I remember the recruiters saying, I told the recruiters, I said, well, I got to be honest with you, I'm pretty liberal. And they said, son, in the Marine Corps, you just do what you're told. We don't care whether you're liberal or not. And once you get into that kind of an institution, it becomes very naive to think that you're going to change it. You're either going to work for it or they're going to crush you. Those are the two options. And that's not just the military. That's any major corporate institution. That's how they function. And those who are promoted within those institutions don't serve the individuals within the institution. That was true at the New York Times. They serve the corporation. They serve the interests of the people who run the institution. That's how they get promoted. So I think that part of the problem is that we're naive about power. We need to go back and read our C. Wright Mills and, maybe even the older theorists like Gramsci and Rosa Luxemburg and even Marx. But if we don't understand power, then we're inevitably going to be ineffectual. We have to understand power and how it works. We have to understand where the real centers of power lie. And that's what Occupy Wall Street got. They didn't waste their time in Washington. They attempted to occupy Wall Street. You can't, in the American political system, vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. You can't. It's impossible. Or Raytheon or Chevron or anyone else. They have carried out a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, and it's over. And you get the kind of face of friendly fascism in the Democratic Party. What you've seen, of course, with the rise of this cult-like Republican Party and the neo-fascists, and I wrote a book on the Christian right, American Fascists, the Christian right and the War in America, is the complete fusion of the establishment Republican Party with the Democratic Party. So, Robert Reich is writing columns about how Liz Cheney would be a great president. I mean, I don't even know what to say to this. But essentially the mask is off. So the Bushes, the Cheneys, the Mitt Romneys, all of the establishment Republicans have become de facto Democrats, which makes sense because on all the substantial issues, there's no difference. Either on trade deals, wholesale surveillance, the war industry. I could never vote for Biden just on a personal level because every time I go in the prison, I know half of my students wouldn't be there but for Biden and Clinton.
Right.
How many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives did they destroy through the massive expansion of the prison system and the 3 strikes you're out laws? And his own son was a drug addict. I mean, it's just really awful. How many hundreds of thousands of lives, and I spent 7 years in the Middle East, did they destroy? I just can't walk away from that human carnage and forgive these people.